Hi there, students. Neap tide or spring tide? Okay, these two are the opposites. So the tide is the sea when it goes up and it goes down. And you've got low tide when the sea is down and high tide when the sea is up. So a spring tide is when there is the maximum difference between high and low tide. So spring tides are when the low tide is very low and the high tide is very high. So you can walk to this island when there is a spring tide, but at all other times you can only get there by swimming or by boat. Okay, that's your spring tide. Yeah, is when it's the maximum or the minimum, but where there's the biggest difference. A neap tide is the opposite. This is when there is the smallest difference between high tide and low tide. Okay, so when there is a spring tide, the moon is either new or full, and both the sun and the moon pull or put on the sea at their full effect, the maximum effect. And the neap tide is when they are acting against each other, so that the amount of tide is very much reduced. Okay, so a spring tide, maximum tide; neap tide, a very small tide. Okay, so I think you're only going to find this word neap in this construction. I think the word neap can also actually mean the pole of a cart that's drawn by two animals. You have a cart and maybe two horses, and the neap is the pole in the middle, but that's really quite unusual. Okay, so a spring tide, where the difference between high tide and low tide is the minimum, a neap tide, and a spring tide where the difference between the two is the maximum. Okay, so a neap tide. Formality for spring tide, neap tide. I think spring tide everyone will understand, and I would give it a 5 in formality. A neap tide, I think many people might not know this. I'm probably going to give it 6 in formality, but it defines exactly what it is. Okay, and then as to origin, okay, a neap tide comes from Old English nap, meaning lacking or scant, from Proto-Germanic nopis, meaning narrow. Okay, so yeah, a neap tide where there's not much of a tide, a spring tide where there is a super large tide. So enough. If you enjoyed the video, give it a rating, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you soon. Bye for now. Neap tide and spring tide.